Okay, so I'd like to now invite the man of the night up to the stage. Oh boy. Okay, see if I can get this thing to work. Okay, well, thanks to the previous speakers for their kind words.
Two fingers.
Okay, so look, thanks very much. Chris asked me to talk for half an hour or so about the book and the story behind it. After those very kind talks that we've already heard, if anyone here is breeding death adders and has small death adders that would fit inside somebody's slipper, for example, next time you get a litter, can you please just give me a call? There's at least 3 that I'd like to buy. Okay, so the story of the book, and we've already heard quite a bit about it. Come on. Are the arrows supposed to work? Is there a magic way to? I'm always trying to downloading missing fonts. Scary.
Yes. Did that too, Matt. Sure.
Sorry, one technical difficulties.
Okay. Probably better to go with the slides, so talk among yourselves. If anyone would like to castigate, insult the people that have already talked, that would be fine.
There we go.
Okay, and it'll work. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to talk about what's in the book, my motivations in writing it, the process of writing and sort of the time frame, where it came together, getting the pictures together, and then sort of what happens from here on. And of course, the hidden subtext within the whole thing is I get to show you pictures of myself when I was thin and my beard was black and actually at one point even had hair. So, contents of the book, and it's as Glenn said, it's sort of a weird combination of autobiography and snake stories. And I've tried to also embed that within the general story, that the way in which we view snakes in particular, but wildlife in general, and especially Australian wildlife, has changed dramatically over my very long career. I mean, it really was true that the only good snake was a dead snake back in the day, and that really is no longer the case. There are still people out there that will say that, but there is an appreciation that snakes are complex, subtle, worth having around. They do useful things. They're part of the wildlife. You know, when I was a grad student, the National Parks Rangers were killing snakes to protect the public, even though it's a national park. They saw that as part of their job. So the attitude has changed dramatically. So just go through the chapters one by one. As we've already heard, I sort of started out as a snake freak. Critical years were probably in Sydney and then in Canberra, so I had access to the sorts of animals that you get around here when we went to Canberra when I was sort of halfway through high school. Really all that were around there were the blacks and the browns were the common ones and a couple of smaller species. So I kind of pretty much taught myself how to play with them. I didn't really have much to do with the organised groups. I didn't know very much about snakes. I just knew that they were just fantastic creatures and fun to play with. Ultimately, I did manage to survive undergrad, and I decided to do my PhD at Armidale, University of New England, with Hal Hipwell, mostly because he was the only supervisor in Australia that would consider taking a student who would work on snakes, and doing the sort of thing I wanted to do. And so, kind of very similar to Canberra, so it was browns and blacks and tigers and copperheads and so And I had enormous fun, and I didn't realise until I actually started looking in the university library after about a year or so that I was playing with the snakes, that nobody else had ever done it. I just assumed that there must be all this information around about common things like red-bellied black snakes, but nobody knew that the boys were bigger than the girls, and you know, how many kids they had and when they had them and when they mated, and just really what they ate, all the really basic bits of biology. So I got to do a lot of that, and it was enormous fun to kind of peer into that world. I went to Utah for a while as a postdoc. I came back to Sydney, got a postdoc at the University of Sydney and then a job. And the first study I tried to do was on my favourite beast, which are the black snakes, red-bellies. And as Glenn said, I worked on them in several different places, and it was essentially a disastrous failure. But it taught me an enormous amount about the variable ecosystems in Australia. And you know, the notion of average conditions is useless. You know, depending on what's happening out there, weather-wise and so forth, in terms of resources and the like, totally drives the system. It's a whole different world for black snake from one year to the next. And you need to bear that in mind if you're going to start managing and conserving these things. And I suspect that the pet keepers need to keep it in mind as well. Variation is good. These guys do not live in a world that is always fine with a thawed mouse coming in every week. The next big study I got underway, you know, the kids were small. One of them is here, a bit larger now. I couldn't do field work, especially long distance field work, but the Australian Museum was just down the road. It had thousands upon thousands of dead snakes, and I hit upon the idea that maybe the curators would let me cut them up to see what was inside them, and I could get a picture of global snake ecology. I could do every damn snake out there. And to my delight, Hal Cogger immediately said, yeah, no problem. And Alan Greer also, very positive note. I've had a very long and productive relationship with the Australian Museum that continues. I am going to be making Jodie and Dane's life more difficult again next Wednesday, next week, when Terry and I will go in and look inside a few more sea snakes. We're still doing it. And so we got an enormous amount of information, and again, it revealed, you know, that all kinds of guesswork in earlier books and so on had been wrong, and now we had some real info. Often, a lot of these snakes I've never seen in the wild, but it was really exciting to find out a bit about their lives. The first real field work we got going in those days, when I was a baby lecturer at Sydney, was on pythons. National Parks was worried that diamond pythons were being ripped out of the wild by pet keepers. There wouldn't be any pythons left. The pet keepers thought that wasn't true. There were actually a lot of diamonds out there, but nobody knew. And so Dave Slip came along, and we put transmitters in some diamonds. Jerry Swan caught the first one. Bless his heart, he's here. And we basically discovered all kinds of weird things. They've got really interesting sex lives, incredibly different between diamond pythons and carpet pythons, and different carpets in different parts of Australia and so on. But it turned out that really they're very common in the Sydney bushland, but they're damn hard to see. And so people had massively underestimated their abundances, and that really resolved the problem for national parks. They didn't have to be quite so passionate about stopping people having a pet python. And here's Pete Harlow, who was working with me for a long time with Western Australian carpet, the work we did over there with Dave Pearson. The next big study is all about John O'Webb, now at UTS. Did honours with me on blind snakes, and then came to me for a PhD with a suggestion he could work on Hoplocathlus, the broadheads, because there was one site where they were still common. He started a project that's still going. It is one of the world's longest running, most detailed snake ecology projects. It generated all kinds of neat stuff, including these artificial rocks. People break the rocks, they steal them, and the snakes rely on those rocks. They're thermally incredibly distinctive. But we worked out how to build fake ones quite cheaply that we could deploy, and the snakes love them. So at least if some idiot comes through and removes those natural rocks, they take thousands of years to be replaced, but we can go out there very quickly with the artificial rocks, and we can undo some of that damage and keep the snakes around. Next chapter is about, the big venomous stuff. As I've said already, the genus Pseudechus have a special place in my heart. This is a kingy, King Brown, up near Fogdam. I haven't done a hell of a lot of work with the bigger lapids since my PhD, but Pat Whitaker did his PhD on the brown snakes near Leeton in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, and they turned out to be completely different from everything I thought, despite having, 10 or 20 years of experience finding brown snakes in the wild. I just assumed that they were incredibly mobile and so on, and they weren't. They're real homebodies, but they spend most of their life underground. And the occasional times you see them in the middle of that paddock, there's probably a tiny hole quite close by where they came out of. They haven't come, marching from 3 paddocks away. And we did a lot of stuff with the browns on their supposed aggressiveness, which turned out to be nonsense, of course. And the tiger snakes, Fabian Aubrey did a lot of work on the island tiger snakes off southern Australia. There's interesting populations there that have rapidly adapted to island life, to different kinds of food, eating seabirds instead of frogs. And it's a beautiful story about evolution in action. And in the early 80s, I got a chance to head up to the tropics. And one of the species I was able to work on is another one of my personal favourites, the Arothera file snake. These things are just seriously weird in every conceivable way. They're just a wonderful beast. That's Rob Lambeck, who was my first research assistant. We went out with Indigenous people who were very good at harvesting file snakes for food, and we learned an enormous amount from them. And it was a real eye-opener, for a kid that had grown up in southern Australia, and sort of I'd read, Eric Weddell's stories about the tropics and so on, but I'd never been there. And it was great to see the tropics, and that's really where most of my snake research has been ever since. I fell in love with Fogdam, mostly because it had huge numbers of water pythons, Dave Slip, and I pretending to mark a snake with the camera. And I employed Thomas Madsen for that work, and Thomas is still going up every year and surveying the pythons. He's working at Deakin University now. But again, that's turned into an incredibly long-running project that's told us an enormous amount about how weather conditions changing from year to year affect the biology of these populations, and that's, again, something you really want to know. If you want to conserve these guys or manage them, you've got to have some idea of what is driving this incredibly linear variation. And also at Fogdam, the quiet Canadian, Greg Brown, turned up, and 20 years later he's still there. And Greg walks the wall of Fogdam every night. He misses about a dozen nights a year on average, but otherwise he's out there every night at dusk. And so we know what snakes and frogs and so forth were crossing the Fogdam wall every night for the last 20 years. And so that gave us an incredible data set. And for example, we wanted to know the impact of cane toads. Everybody had stories. Cane toads are going to devastate the snake fauna. But Greg had been counting the snakes for several years before toads arrived, and counting them for many years afterwards. And the answer is absolutely crystal clear. Snakes of almost every kind have become much more common at Fogdam since the cane toads arrived. Cane toads kill the goannas used to eat the snakes, goannas are no longer eating the snakes, most kind of snakes become more common. And especially things like black-headed pythons that were very rare animals, that are now quite abundant animals. So that kind of long-term data gives you a perspective on conservation issues that you otherwise wouldn't get. And lastly, a little bit more philosophical, I guess, the way in which our attitudes have changed. And as I said at the beginning, we see a greater appreciation of snakes. Kids tend to grow up thinking snakes are interesting rather than evil and awful. And I think there's a lot of encouraging messages out there. That's the book. Why did I write it? One of the things that worries all geriatric gentlemen is the fact that our society is becoming increasingly fragmented and people aren't talking to each other, and fake news is taking over and so on. And science used to have a special status, and people used to think that they could go to science to get the answer to a question, and that would drive public policy. But of course these days, the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry, the anti-evolution, religiously inclined folks, very successfully managed to undermine the role of science. And so science is seen as just another opinion these days. And it's not true. There is something different about peer-reviewed science. It's not just an opinion. It is testing reality against your ideas, and your ideas will be discarded if they don't fit. So I really wanted to sort of explain the process of doing science in its glorious, chaotic, jumbled, rather inefficient way of getting there. You know, lots of false turns, but you know, you do find stuff out, and that stuff is reliable. It's a good basis for making decisions. And of course, on a personal level, it was a chance to tell the stories about places and people and animals that have been so much fun to spend time with. And to write, you know, lurid descriptions of all those people who spent time with them. I actually worked on the book over a long period. I wrote Cane Toad Wars in about 2013-14, and I immediately found a publisher for it, but the publisher took forever to get it out. So it wasn't until 2018 that it actually came out, and it was launched by the AHS, bless their hearts, thanks Chris. And essentially what happened was that a whole bunch of people in charge of various relevant units at the publisher, University of California Press, all left and went to other jobs and didn't tell the people coming in about the book. So they didn't know about it, and then a year later I'd email them and say what's happening, and they'd say, oops, we didn't know about that. And that happened about 3 times. But anyway, finally it came out. I had really enjoyed writing Cane Toad Wars because I thought it was an interesting story about the reality of conservation politics and the role of research and so on. And I thought, well, look, that was so much fun. I'll keep going and I'll write the snake equivalent. I'll write the history of my research on snakes, a little bit more autobiographical. And at the time I was thinking I was about to retire and that I'd have plenty of time. I'd sit on the back porch and with a laptop and I'd tap away. And I did retire. And then a few months later I thought, oh, bugger this. And so I went back to Sydney Union. I worked for another several years and then I retired again. And then after a few months I thought, oh, bugger this, and I took a job at Macquarie. So the retirement didn't quite work out the way that I expected, but I am only working part-time now, and it's given me more time. And so the book sort of evolved, and you know, weekends and evenings I would write it. I really enjoy that kind of writing. And when it was all finished, I sat down and realised I had a huge problem. A book has to be around about 100,000 words, approximately. And I had written well over 200,000 words about snakes. And that clearly wasn't going to fly, and I couldn't see any way to cut it down. And so I thought I'm going to have to cut it in half. And I thought about dividing it up by lineages of snakes or by topics, conceptual areas, and they didn't seem to work really well. And in the end I came up with a very simple solution, which that I would talk about all my Australian research in one book and my overseas research in another one, because they were about the same size when I put them together, if I divided it that way. So a couple of people have alluded to the fact that I've worked in other places, and I am indeed, and I've told that story. I've just got to get the book out. Having written the text of the current book, I needed the illustrations, so there was no money available, and so I wrote begging emails to a bunch of photographers, and I was deluged with offers of phenomenal photographs. I mean, I guess one of the things that really strikes me is the quality of the images that are out there now compared to 1991 when I wrote that original book. I mean, you wouldn't even look at any of the photos I used in 1991 because now they're just absolutely fantastic. And I'll give a shout out to Rob Valenti. I use a lot of his pictures in the book. He was incredibly generous, and the guy just has some freakish touch with being able to capture snakes and their postures and so on in phenomenal photos. So thanks very much to all the photographers, especially to Rob. So what comes next? The grand old book, Australian Snakes, is going to be, I just heard this week, they want to reprint it again after a bit of a long gap. So I'm currently choosing an image for the cover. Rob Delaney has been sending me fantastic photos. This is my current favourite, so this is probably the one that might come out next year. But there are so many phenomenal pictures out there of beautiful snakes. And of course, I've got helpful friends who are making a whole bunch of other suggestions about what would be the most appropriate cover species to use. So, I'll turn now to the future. The second snake book is pretty much done. This is the overseas one. Research in Sumatra, Sweden, China, Manitoba, the Indo Pacific. It's a little bit different than the others in that this is, I didn't have enough money early in my career to go to these far-flung places and do research, but I got to a point where I did have enough resources to do it, and the kids were starting to grow up, and it was a little bit easier to travel, and so I decided I would search out places around the planet where I could get access to vast numbers of snakes to try to do the sorts of research I was interested in. One of the first was in Sumatra, where I went to the slaughterhouses where they kill hundreds of thousands of reticulated pythons and blood pythons and literally millions of water monitors every year. These are field-caught animals. They're brought back to local, the backyard basically, and killed and skinned and so on. Remarkably, everything we learned suggests that that's a highly sustainable harvest. And in fact, Dan Matush, one of my former students, went back to the same slaughterhouses a couple of years ago, more than 20 years after we were there. The same people operate them, they get exactly the same numbers of snakes, the snakes are exactly the same size, same sex ratio, same body condition, same everything. It's a sustainable harvest because the pythons are actually exploiting human development. They're eating rats around the villages and the palm oil plantations and so on, so they're taking advantage of people as the people take advantage of the pythons. In Sweden, Thomas Madsen had already gathered a phenomenal data set with radio tracking on European adders that gives us more detail than anyone's ever achieved on the details of the sex life of an adder, which males fight which other males for access to which females, and how many kids does the female have, and who are the fathers, and all this sort of stuff. So that there's an incredible richness of detail there about the way that microevolutionary processes work within an Australian, within a snake population. It's still never been equal. I went to the reptile park one day and John Weigel showed me a book called China Snake Island that had just arrived in his massive library. And it talked about this little island off sort of east of Beijing in the Bohai Sea that had supposedly this fantastic density of pit vipers. And it sounds ludicrous, but if you look at the map, it's a stepping stone island. Any little bird that lives in Southeast Asia that wants to fly to Siberia to breed, birds that are migrating don't like to fly over open water. It's probably dangerous, so they pick these little stepping stone islands to progress. And Shidao is right in the middle of the biggest gap. And so millions of birds every year fly up from Southeast Asia to Siberia, and then they and the kids fly back down again in autumn. And these vipers live on this little island. They're only active for a few weeks in the spring and a few weeks in autumn, and the birds are there. Otherwise, they're just completely inactive. But the density is approximately 1 pit viper per metre squared. So you're talking hundreds of pit vipers in an area the size of this room. It's an amazing place. I've never been anywhere like it. And because the snakes have only got a few weeks to catch their birds, so they completely ignore people, and so that it's very easy to find dead birds and shit out. The snakes can't hang on to every bird they strike, so the area is full of fluttering birds. Sorry, Anne. Andrew likes birds. That's your problem, not mine. So I ran lots of experiments with dead birds and with little balloons with hot water and cold water and things like that, looking at the cues that a pit viper cares about if it decides, trying to decide whether or not to launch a strike. The most spectacular aggregations, though, are the big garter snake dens in Canada. This is not a posed photo. This is a garter snake den. These are all garter snakes. I walked down to that den and sat down to fire up some data loggers, some temperature loggers that I had, and within 10 minutes, as it warmed up, these snakes all emerged from under the rocks, and so the numbers are phenomenal. Tens of thousands of snakes, again, in an area the size of this room would might have 50,000 snakes. There are piles of them. They suffocate each other with the weight of the ones above. Never try a mark recapture program at a Manitoba snake den. I foolishly did it. I had 2 students to help me. Well, one of them's never talked to me since. One day we weighed, measured, sexed over 1,000 garter snakes. It's horrible. They're very smelly. I got interested in sea crates, bloody quarter. They spend a week on land, the telemetry shows, and they sit around, they just digest their eel and don't do very much. They're very sluggish, you can pick them up, kids, the Fijian kids pick them up and tie them in knots around their necks and so on. They're deadly venomous, but they just do not want to bite you. And then for the next week, they go into the water to go foraging, and they turn into these little ever-ready bunnies. They're just perpetual motion machines. They fly through the water, and they're frantically looking for eels. And then they come back and they turn into slugs again. It's a weird, an interesting beast. So we've worked on them in Fiji, Vanuatu, and New Caledonia. And New Caledonia, which I visited initially for the sea crates, turned into the hub of our research on the true sea snakes, the guys that never come out of water. So that's turned into the Shine family summer holiday in January for 20 years in a row. We have hundreds and hundreds of these little guys, turtle-headed sea snakes with microchips in. We catch them every year. Some snakes we catch every year. They don't go anywhere. They have tiny home ranges. If we catch a turtle-headed sea snake every year for a decade, it will certainly be within an area the size of this room, and probably much smaller. They just don't go anywhere. The big guys, like the greater sea snake here, Hydrophis major, travel much further, but we've started working on them in more recent times with acoustic transmitters. But that's turned into a big study as well. So that next book is about what you can learn from being able to travel around the world and look for places where there's a hell of a lot of snakes. After that, I've got 2 other books underway. This one is sort of a history of research on snake ecology, because it's, there was almost nothing known when I started my PhD in 1972. And now we know a lot. And it's interesting to reflect on the pioneers and the methods that got developed, and the fallen warriors, the people that died of snakebite and things like that in the course of doing research. And I think it's an interesting story. So I'm trying to tell that, and I've just actually signed a contract to do a textbook, but that'll be a few years off, I think. The pioneer one, let me just give you a quick flavour. There is an amazing set of human beings involved. This room, I'm sure, is testament to the fact that to really be fascinated by snakes, you've got to be a complete weirdo. And so the pioneer snake ecologists are a really strange and wonderful bunch. Rudolf Mel was a German that set up a school in China and travelled all around China doing snaky things. Henry Fitch is sort of the father of snake ecology from the USA that developed a lot of the methods like the snake traps and so on. Hajime Fukada did the same kind of thing as Fitch did, but just in the suburbs of Kyoto. Hubert Saint-Jouan was sort of a part physiologist, but part behaviourist in France, who did wonderful things with vipers for many years. And I knew a couple of these guys and corresponded with one of the others. Mel was before my time. And so, I think it's interesting to reflect on the sort of things that they did. I'll finish with just one pioneer that particularly appeals to me that some of you will have heard of. It's a guy called CJP Ioannidis, Bobby to his friends, or Iodine. He was one of the pioneers in Africa. He was an Englishman, joined the army so that he could get to Africa, and then he immediately left the army and he became a poacher, elephant poacher for several years, and that was a hard way to make a living. So he got a job as a game ranger instead, and he had a long and illustrious career as a game ranger, and he shot lots of man-eating lions and all this kind of stuff. But he had health problems. He had terrible thromboses in both legs, to the point that it was very hard for him to walk. So he could no longer keep being a game ranger, and he was sort of forced into retirement. And he ended up living in a little hut on the Tanganyika-Mozambique border, in an area that was sort of part forest and part agricultural land. And he realised that there was a market for venomous snakes, for their venom and for zoos and the like. And so for the next, 15 years or so, Ioannidis lived in this little hut, incredibly primitive. He hated modern life. He wouldn't countenance a typewriter. He hated ballpoint pens. This was a man who was famous for his incredible obscene vocabulary when anything annoyed him in the slightest. Tiny little orphan guy, but he was sort of the undisputed boss of the whole area. So if any of the local people who were doing their agricultural work saw a snake, they would watch it and they would send a runner to Ioannidis' hut. And Ioannidis would then go to catch the snake. Now the way he could do that was that he had a specially constructed one-wheel carriage that he could sit in, and he had a couple of big muscular local blokes that would roll him through the bush. So he could only go 10 miles, was about as far as he could go. When he got there, he would clamber out of his little carriage and he would catch these snakes. The numbers are amazing. I've printed it out just because I'll make sure I get it wrong. He captured 973 green mambas within a radius of 10 miles of his home within a 5-year period. 973. He caught 302 baboon vipers in an area of 3 miles by 2 miles, including catching 217 baboon vipers in 47 days. One day, he captured 18 green mambas and 1 boomslang in a 3.5-hour period, only stopping because his hand became tired. So, this was a guy that was virtually, was disabled and virtually non-functional, and he caught thousands upon thousands of these incredibly dangerous snakes. I mean, black mambas are one of the hardest things to handle. And one of the great joys of my professional life was that about 3 years ago, I finally tracked down Ioannidis' diaries, his field diaries. He kept detailed records of every capture, the size of the snake, where it was, all that kind of stuff. And I got my hands on it. And so I was able to analyse it and pick up all these interesting patterns about shifts in habitat use with age and species differences and seasonal effects and so on. And I could just feel good old Iodine, looking over my shoulder and screaming obscenities at me when I got anything wrong. It was enormous fun. And he's just one of many colours. So, that's all I'm going to talk about. The most important story, I guess, is to thank everybody. Most obviously the people that contributed to the production of the book, the photographers and so on, people at CRC Press. But an enormous number of people played a huge role throughout. There's a phenomenal number of students and former students, there's postdocs, there's colleagues, there's Meryl, who's been my research assistant for about 127 years. It might only be 27 years, but it's still a long time. There's my family, my brothers here, my brother and sister, and parents tolerated my obsession with snakes more than any reasonable human being probably should have. My wife Terry has played an integral role in a huge amount of it. She took a lot of photos for the book. Ben, I'm sure, has caught more sea snakes than most people of his age. So I've had an enormous amount of help from a fantastic number of people all the way through, including with the book. Special thanks to Chris, who really talked me into this, and I think the guy's just got a genius for organising things. AHS, which is such a fantastic organisation. Thanks to all of you for coming along. My publisher tells me that whenever I get a chance, I should ask people to put reviews out on Amazon or anywhere else you can do that. That only applies if you like the book. And I hope to see you back here in a year or two for the next installment. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rick. Consider the book launched. I'm sure we have a bottle of champagne or something to smash over a copy of it, but the book is now launched. Food has been delivered to the tables. We will take a break for a little while and we will come back after you've had a chance to eat and drink and be merry, and there are a few items there which we'll be auctioning off.